So this is the website that we're on here. It's on the card. I just got it up and running this week. So if you want to go in and check me out, see what the service is, visit my profiles there. A lot of you I knew before I left, but not everybody knows where I've been since I left. So I kind of toured around, and you'll find the why and everything on there. Just the Coles notes for those that haven't heard or haven't been around is I left here in 01 to go to school specifically for marketing. I actually had the idea of this business before I left, was what I thought I wanted to do. Took 2 years at Olds, ended up in Cargill because they had sort of a similar program to what I was thinking at the time, but didn't think I had enough experience, so I worked sales there and bought there for a couple of years. So I got some experience on the merchandising side, on the sales side, buying, blending, the works. And then in 2008, they decided to expand their marketing program to a full service. So then I moved into the full service role, and there was 5 of us then that created their Market Sense program. So with Cargill just in Congress, I imagine most of you had somebody around to talk to you about Market Sense. So I was one of the founders of that. So we started that in 2008. And when I left, that was about an $8 million product. So the product definitely did come around, and the demand came around for market consulting. So eventually I've been there long enough that I felt like I was using my own information as much as the company, so I decided I was ready to go on my own, and that's how I got back here. I guess family's here too, but that's not what I mean. It helps a little bit. So yeah, go ahead and check it out. There's also just lots of articles on there, about a year's worth of material. So if you want to go back and see what I was thinking about different markets prior to seeding through summer and recently, it's all on there. I will eventually get to a point where I'm sold out or near capacity, and then I'll move that information all into private, and it'll be my clients that own that information. So it's there for now to try and promote myself. Once I'm sold out, then I'll move it back to private, and that'll be the property of my clients, basically. I'll keep it live, and I'll always put some stuff that I find interesting in there, but specific recommendations and strategies will be on my clients eventually. So it's there, it's up and running and live. Check it out anytime. If you do, and you see anything there, and want to give me some feedback, by all means. I say it's brand new, so it's not too late to improve it. Okay, so I'm assuming you guys didn't come because you gave a shit about where I've been for the last 10 years. You want to know what's happening in the markets. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to look at a few things specifically that I look at through the course of the year in my analysis. I call myself a fundamentalist, so I look at supply and demand tables. I grind through yields, exports, acres, those sorts of things for Canadian crops, especially for the crops here. They're not traded crops, so you don't get a market report daily. There's no liquidity there, so really that's where the information is derived from anyway, supply and demand for your cash crops, right? Your lentils, your flax, your peas. There's no futures market. Information is hard to find, so it's really supply and demand that's going to drive the prices eventually. Picking the top and the bottom, that's the tough part, but you can kind of pick a direction, and you can understand if the prices are justified or if they're just going to be short-term in a blip by looking at what the supply and demand tells you. So I'm going to look at that a little bit. A big part of supply and demand, of course, is what you're motivated to do. Are you motivated to grow more or less acres? Are you motivated to switch crops? Those sorts of things. So a large part of my analysis is to look at, in Western Canada, average returns for all the key crops. So I can try to anticipate what the changes to the acres will be next year and try to forecast things out there. So it's not a perfect system. Nobody has a perfect system, but this is a big part of it. So I'll get through as much as I can today. I won't get through all of it. It's just mountains of data that will bore the hell out of you. But we'll touch on some highlights. So I've really prepared for 6 crops. I know there are guys that grow other crops. There'll be chickpeas, there'll be mustard and other crops in the area. there's just not enough data available in those smaller crops, so I thought I'd stick to the ones that multiple people would be growing. I'm also going to look at, towards the end of the day, look at options. So, I think you know me now. Oh yeah, the other thing is some of you will be familiar with the Growing Forward program and Farm Business Development Initiative. So I'm just completing the process this week of being registered on there as a consultant. So if you have already gone through the process or are interested in it, there's dollars available there for all kinds of different consulting and training. Whether it's my service or otherwise, if you have any questions, you can give me a shout anytime and I can help you through the process of how to access the government's money. It's about 10 grand a person on the farm that you can access. So anybody that makes more than $35,000 a year can access about 10 grand for consulting through the FBDI. Up to 5 people per farm. So say I prepared for the 6 crops. If you have questions about others, I'm happy to answer them. If you have questions as I go, please just interrupt, stop me. You get bored, tell me you're bored, move on. I want you guys to take from this what you came here for, and that's probably information on your specific crops. Some of you probably have ideas coming in, and that's why you're interested in coming in the first place. So let's make sure they get answered. Please don't feel like you can't interrupt me anytime, okay? Everybody's good with the agenda? So, after saying that I'm a fundamentalist, and that I look at supply and demand tables all day, the first 2 things I want to talk about are actually global trends that I think are important, and are not directly fundamental, but are related to fundamental. So this is a map that I've had on my desktop ever since I first became an advisor. It's really busy, and it's 2005, so it's dated, but it gives you an idea of the grain flow. So who's growing what and where's it going? And by the size of the arrows, you can tell whether they're a big or a small player, right? So even at this time, and they're a lot bigger now, Brazil and Argentina and soybeans and soy meal are now actually have surpassed the U.S. combined. The U.S. is much bigger now than it was then, but it was big then in soy meal and soybeans. Corn as well. So they're key producers there. China's a big producer, but you can see at about this time and from then on, they've evolved very much into an net import balance. They can't supply for the people anymore. And that was one of the biggest changes in the markets that I think made the markets a lot healthier for long term. China in 1990 bought basically 0 beans from the U.S. They weren't buying anything then. And now they're buying over half of the U.S. crop. So the Americans are seeding in the high 80s to 90 million acres. Almost half of that crop is destined for China at some point. And close to 3/4 of the Brazil and Argentine crop are being exported, almost all of that to China. So China's appetite for beans is one of the key drivers in the last 20 years that turned the market for the better, made it so that we can actually make money in this business again. The second being ethanol, corn for ethanol. U.S.-based corn for ethanol at the millennium was just an idea. It was challenged, questioned all the way through, but it took hold. And with the blend mandate now, we're at about half of the U.S. crop for ethanol. So half of that 90 million acres times 168 bushels per acre is going into ethanol, not into food or pig food.
Is it a different corn for ethanol than for beef?
There are specs that convert better than others, but basically it's a multi-purpose. Where it's destined, they don't grow it based on where it's destined for. If you've got an ethanol plant right next door, you might do a production contract like you would with Belt Plain. If you're further away, then you leave your options open. So those 2 changes, corn for ethanol and beans for China, are the big ones. The other thing that this reminds me of all the time, so when I'm doing my analysis, you have to always remember where is actually important. So, you know, if you hear a weather story from Africa or from the EU or Russia, different stories, are they really important to us? Does it really matter to us? Or is it just news? Because we get so much news so fast now, with the internet, everything flows so quickly, that most of it's crap. It's just repeated, overdone, like it's not really going to affect you directly. So you need to be able to filter out what is going to affect you directly. So the areas of focus for us, because we're neighbors to the US, you gotta look at corn, beans, and wheat. Corn, beans, and wheat, North America, South America, Russia, Australia, they matter. The rest, they matter, but much less. Importing, so our smaller crops, durum, that's a African demand story in a lot of cases. There's other demand in the US and Mexico in particular, but Africa is a key market for durum. So what the weather's doing in Africa and in France, because they're right next door, that's where they were going to get their durum. So for durum, you got to watch Africa and the EU a little bit more. Pulse crops, lentils, peas, chickpeas. China, of course. China matters to everything, but India and the Middle East there. Your lentils, it's an Indian and a Turkey story, basically. Depends on their crop. I mean, what we're getting paid for lentils is probably 95% attributed to India losing 2 consecutive crops. And seeding another crop into dry acres. So they can be very small importers when they grow big crops. They always import some. They're not self-sufficient. But when they lose a crop, they need to replace that supply. And whatever they can't get from Turkey right next door, they come to Canada and the US for the most part. I guess Australia too. I can't leave Australia either, but they're not a huge player. You'll hear about them. We heard about them this summer, seeing record chickpea acreage and drought and things like that. So we hear about Australia a lot. They're not the biggest driver, but they're important. So the map is a little bit harder to see, but this is the other thing that I have to keep in mind all the time. So North America is by far the biggest exporter. That's why our crop matters so much to the world, right? It's not just that the futures markets happen to be located in the US, it's that the US and Canada combined export a massive share of the world's trade. So what happens here is very, very important to the world, which is great if you're an analyst, because you can analyze what's happening right next door and understand how it affects the rest of the world. South America is growing. This is as of 2007. So their net exports are much higher now. Most of them going to China. Where's the grain going? China, basically. Middle East is importing. Africa is importing in a big way. Europe's basically self-sufficient. But what matters to us is our competition, right? So North America, South America, Australia, exporter. Russia, exporter. So those are the areas that I always focus on. If you're looking at news stories, articles, weather, they're the ones that matter. That's why when Russia started invading Ukraine last year, why it was so important. They are both significant exporters of grain, and if they weren't going to export that grain, that's a real story. So the market took that and ran with it real hard. Of course, eventually that supply came back to the market and the prices came right back to the pre-conflict. But the reason that one got so much attention is because Russia and Ukraine matter in the wheat world. They matter big time. They're a big part of why the U.S. isn't exporting right now and why our exports are a little bit slower on cereal crops. Because they have a serious logistical advantage into some of the end users. India being another one too, for wheat as well. So, this gives you an idea of where we're focusing and why. The first of the two major global issues that I'm watching right now and that I think has impacted and will continue to impact the market is what's happened to the US dollar relative to the rest of the world in the last 3 years. Relative to an index, so the US dollar index, I don't know all the currencies that are in there, but indexed, it's up 24% against a basket of 10 or 12 other currencies. So if you're going to the US for goods, we know what it's like to go across the border here, right? It's the same for everybody else when they're buying beans and corn. It's 25% more expensive than it was 3 years ago. The US is big competition for exports. Canada, we've got a 30% off sale going on in 3 years compared to the US, right? Look at South America and the soybean story. Why is the US not exporting soybeans? Why are they building stockpiles on the farm and not hitting the numbers? Because China's going to South America. They grew 2 record crops in a row, And on the exchange side of things, they're way cheaper. The only currency that hasn't really devalued against the US is the Chinese. So all of these numbers apply to the Chinese as well. So basically China's buying everything on sale right now. And they're threatening to slow things down and forcing the market lower to make that sale even bigger, because they can. I still think eventually they'll come back. Every time demand picks up and exports pick up, if there's any momentum going, you'll hear China slowing down. They're increasing interest rates. That story's going to come back over and over and over again for the next while to keep a lid on commodity prices. Behind it all, back end loaded, I believe they are buying, and the demand isn't actually going away, but they're going to threaten it going away, and just the fear of it going away is enough to force commodity markets down. China and the US are basically, like, all of these areas are important, but China and the US are by far what's happening between those two countries is your biggest driver of grain. Corn, soybeans, and wheat, those are your index grains, and those big three are traded between those two countries rapidly. So this is a big one. It's not a fast-moving one. It's not an easy to fix one. And I don't know if we want it fixed, because we're winning this. A lot of why we're exporting to meet demand, especially cash crops, is because of this. The U.S. just grew a bigger crop of all their special crops. So they seeded more acres of lentils, they seeded more acres of flax, more acres of oats, more acres of malt. Because with all this going on, their soybeans and their corn and their wheat are not as lucrative as they used to be. So they jump, especially in the fringe areas, right? So not so much in your corn and bean belts out to the Great Lakes and in the good ground. But once you get outside of that and get into Kansas, North Dakota, Montana, Texas, they're growing other crops now. They're growing the same special crops that we are. And they grew a good crop this year. So they've got a big supply down there. But they're not moving it because ours is so cheap. We grow a smaller crop, the prices are up. But relative to them, we still got an advantage. So I'm not sure that we want to fix this real fast, except that it's just a wet blanket on it all at the end of the day. As they continue to build supplies and bearish news comes out, and you saw what happened with the last USDA report, everybody's expecting it to be bearish. It was. The market still forced lower down, even though everybody's expecting it going in. So it's just, if beans, corn, and wheat can't get bullish, it's really hard for the rest to go. So we're in a good spot here with the cash crops. They're the easiest to go, but your wheat and your canola, it's going to be hard to make them rally too far as long as this situation exists. Now, the quicker way to not fix or change this, and the advantage will still be there, but the quickest way to correct things and get things going the right way is Argentina and Brazil are seeding their crop right now, and if that falls on its face. Because they're such a big grower in the bean market, our nearest opportunity, the most important crop being produced in the next 4 months, is Brazil and Argentina soybeans. So in the next 4 months, because nobody else is really producing important crops, that's your headline. It's weather in Argentina and Brazil and what's happening to that crop. So that can help us, that can hurt us, it can do both, it can go up and down, but really that's what's going to matter in the next 4 months. The rest, hopefully, with this foreign exchange and what's going on, we're going to continue to make exports and tighten up our balance sheets, getting rid of supply, just basically demand side erosion, so that by spring, hopefully the supplies have eroded enough for the end use, but we've got a little bit more potential and a little bit more competition for acres going on. Because as it sits right now, it's not real pretty. Prices are great on a couple of commodities, but do they really need to go higher? When we look at the supply and demand tables, I'm not sure that they do in some cases. So is everybody okay with this theory? You've heard it before, seen it before. I know everybody's gone across the border, so we understand directly what happens one-to-one. But on a global scale, when you start looking at the size of some of these numbers, I mean, devaluing or increasing in value by 100% versus Argentina, and that's going to affect trade significantly, right? And I put an article into, if you want to kind of look at some examples and clarify the theory a little bit more. I did put an article out that's on the website too about this currency issue. Now the second one is like, it's the great hope for grains, right? Everybody's seen these, right? Anybody not seen these maps in the last 2 months? No. Everybody believe that that's going to make the grain prices bullish in the next little while? I know a couple that do, but... And I should throw a disclaimer before I get too far into this. I am not a big believer in trading and hedging and managing your risk based on long-term global trends for weather. I mean, we can't predict what's going to happen next week. And what is El Nino really? What defines an El Nino? I got some of these slides off the surf site, so I'll ask the surf. What defines an El Nino?
Warming trend in the ocean.
Warm water in the ocean. Ocean temperatures above normal. What happens in the U.S., what happens here, what happens in South America, India, anywhere in the world, what happens everywhere else, that does not define an El Nino. There are correlations and trends that have been measured over the last 120 years, but really all an El Nino means is that there's warm water off the coast of South America and stretching across towards Australia. That's all El Nino means. That's all it means. So it may or may not help things. The correlations that have been measured as far as moisture and things go could help. And this is why everybody's following it so closely and why everybody wants to believe there's an El Nino, because it's going to fix grain prices. Look at the dry trend. Okay, so where is it going to be dry? And the other thing about El Nino, the strongest correlation in weather patterns is November and March. So November and March, who's producing grain? We're not, Russia's not, China's not, South America, Southern Hemisphere basically is. So who's important in the Southern Hemisphere? Brazil, big time. Argentina, slightly wet, but more or less normal. So Brazil is the big watch. Is there going to be a drought in Brazil? Please let there be a drought in Brazil. Everybody wants a drought in Brazil except the Brazilian. And they don't really care. They're happy now. They're going to have less tariffs and taxes, and governments are changing. Brazil, Argentina more so, I guess, than Brazil. So this is an important one. Out of all the El Nino events, that's one of the most important. Second most to Canada is India. Because the correlation is there, it is happening. They've had 2 consecutive drought crops, right? So India harvests their, should I get this right, their Kharif crop in October, November. Then they reseed and they harvest the Rabi crop in March, April, and they reseed again and again. So 2 crops a year there. So there's 2 opportunities in South America, one in Australia and one in Canada. There's 5 crops every year that can change your pulse crop market. This year, India failed twice. The first time was right during our seeding. You can see it if you go back and watch the bids. Right when they were combining, the bids turned. Right? And it wasn't based on what was happening here. It was based on their harvesting a bad crop and seeding into marginal conditions. Marginal conditions they seeded into, they're harvesting right now. Bad crop again. So after harvest, when there's a serious risk, this time of year there's always a big risk of pulse crops dropping because you've got 3 harvests happening, right? Because they're harvesting one of their 2 crops. Australia's about a month and a half behind us, and we're harvesting. So September, October are dangerous months for pulse crops. If all 3 of those hit, look up. If all 3 of those fail, and that's where we are this year. So we're 3 for 3 on failing. Prices are where they are. Do they need to go a lot higher? The story can't get a whole lot better for high prices. Let's put it that way. I think from here on out, it's more likely to get worse because it just can't get a whole lot better. Whatever we grew, whatever Stats Canada says we grew, whatever I think we grew, whatever you think we grew, there's demand for it because of this. So it's going to go and we're going to be tight. So that's a good thing. But don't take that for granted. Australia still produces a crop next year. We still see a crop next spring. they're watching our climate to see how much we see, and they'll start hearing about that in February, March. So don't take too much for granted what's available. What's happened couldn't have been better for our prices. Couldn't be better for here because we had a crop. There's a large part of the province that didn't have a crop and can barely cover the first 10 bushels at 20%. So don't feel too bad if you missed the high, because there's guys hurting a whole lot worse in the lentil market. And their hurt helped you guys too, in all honesty. So this is the El Nino story, but wet for the U.S. So to me, while dry in Australia, I should mention that, and they have been drier than normal. I wouldn't say drought or disaster, but drier than normal. So they'll have a little bit less to export. One of the headlines out of Australia this year was a record chickpea seeding acres. That didn't yield, so they're not going to have a record production at the end of the day, but still a bigger production of chickpeas, which there'll be demand for too. See what happened with the chickpea demand here. And that's an Indian story. Now, the reason why this is time limited is because after Argentina, after Australia, after India produce their next crop, it's our turn again, and the U.S.'s turn. And El Nino does not predict a bad crop in the U.S. In fact, the opposite. In years following an El Nino, it's actually much more likely to have a big crop than a small crop in North America. Western Canada is slightly below average, so there's a little bit of fear out there that it might be dry for us. But remember, this is a November to March, so it might not snow all winter. This should be easing off when the patterns come back to normal in the spring, if the correlations hold. Big if. I mean, this is just, like I said, El Nino is hot water. It doesn't mean any of this is going to happen. These are just measurable correlations that somebody's banging away and trying to figure out. So absolutely no guarantees that any of this comes true. This is just historical studies of warm water years, okay? And of those years, the reason it's getting so much hype, this is the warmest. So it could be a record, a super El Nino. So the water temperature is at its most extreme, but that doesn't mean the rest of the world weather correlates.
But it means that something is going to happen.
Something is probably going to happen.
Yeah.
But where and how much, and that's what we just don't know. And that's why I don't place too heavy on that. Basically, don't bet the farm
No, it's wild card.
on El Nino. But it is a wild card. And, yeah, to be honest, it would help us more than it would hurt us because of the time of it. So, kind of cheering for the El Nino. So those are the two global stories. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on, but like I said, it's a lot of it's noise. To me, these are the two that matter right now. These are the two that have impacted what's happening and set us up for where we are. And they're the two that I think will matter going forward.